Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our discussion on the impact of goal setting on company culture. My name is Lauren Ward, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. We're eager to get underway, but just a couple of housekeeping items before we dive in. The session is being recorded, and we will be delivering a copy of the recording to everyone who joined us today within 48 hours of the event, so stay tuned for that. Feel free to take notes, but know that you will own a copy shortly. We'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar, but I encourage you to enter them at any time within the Q&A widget within your Zoom console. And like I said, we have dedicated time at the end to get through to those. Before I introduce our presenters, I just wanted to take a quick look at what you can expect from today's webinar. So Ally recently surveyed more than 4,500 working adults in the US and UK around their approach to goal setting and the impact it has on their company culture, productivity, performance. We're going to be trickling some of the early insights from our goal management report. So that will be a focal point of today's discussion. We'll also be sharing how goals, specifically using OKRs or objectives and key results, can help you to improve the communication, commitment, and engagement we see of high-rated cultures. And of course, we have dedicated time at the end of the presentation to address any questions that you may have. And without further ado, I want to hand things over to our presenters. I'm pleased to be joined by not one, but two great presenters. Alex Bartholomew is the CEO of People Stretch Solutions, and Lindsay Lamba, our Strategic Services Manager at Ally.io. Alex is the president and CEO of People Stretch Solutions, a DC-based management consulting firm. Alex specializes in helping CEOs and fellow business leaders to understand why or why not their people are performing and how to achieve better business results. He's also a published author and professional speaker on a bunch of topics ranging from OKRs, sales effectiveness, elite business performance, and emotional intelligence. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alex.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And I'm also joined by Lindsay, one of my colleagues here at Ally.io. Lindsay is the strategic services team lead at Ally, helping clients to plan their OKR journey, write OKRs, integrate OKRs into their business rhythms, which she's going to walk you through today. Prior to joining Ally, Lindsay worked in venture capital at a startup studio, helping customer validation teams to bring their ideas to life. So thank you also, Lindsay, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And with that, Lindsay, I'm going to hand things over to you to kick us off.
Right. Let's get this started. Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to be here to talk about all things about culture and goals with you all and Alex today. So to kick things off, I want to share a study that Lauren mentioned that we recently conducted at Ally around goal setting. So we surveyed 4,500 working adults across both the US and UK to better understand their goal setting practices. We wanted to learn more about what's working, what are their habits, what do their cultures look like. And what we found was roughly 75% of the people that we surveyed are using goals, which is great. We love to hear that people are setting goals and using frameworks because we have a bias to feeling like this is a key to success. But when we asked the question, who is using these and at what level, we saw that these goal frameworks weren't being used throughout the entire organization. It was mostly at the team and individual levels. Now, why is this even an issue, right? We should just be happy people are using them in the first place. But with our work with several companies, we know that successful goal setting culture starts at the top. So we need to be using these at all levels, company, team, and individual, in order to have alignment and focus for the company. So how do you get everyone aligned? Well, it starts by building a really, really strong company culture around your goal setting framework. And that's what Alex and I are here to talk to you about today, on how you can embed company goals deep within your culture. Alex, I'd love to turn it over to you and see, have you seen similar trends like this with the clients that you've worked with that reflect our survey?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We've seen a bifurcation of this data. So one aspect is we are absolutely seeing people using goal framework. What's interesting though, it doesn't reach everyone. So it's pretty consistent with the data. The interesting thing we also saw that I kind of shared with you as we were preparing is that there's a preponderance of people who say they have goals, but they actually don't have them written down. And so they don't have them written down, and they also don't have a plan to get these goals that are floating in the ether. So I think there's a huge opportunity for companies coming out of the pandemic to really take a hard look at, do they have an implicit goal framework, something that has been cobbled together over years, or is it something that's explicit, but they're just not being rigorous? I think this study really begs a lot of really good questions that we're going to explore and certainly share some insight on as we go through this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think so. With those things in mind, I think something that you touched on, it's not just enough to have one, but adopting a goal management framework at the company level is key. So what can we all do at our respective organizations to increase alignment, focus, accountability, while improving our culture to adopt this? So let's dive in. Let's talk more about the how. I think step one, you have to start with a clarified mission and vision. So when in our survey, we found that employees who knew and believed in their company's mission rated their companies a much higher 78 out of 100 in their company culture. Employees who didn't know what the mission and vision was rated a 48 out of 100. So this isn't a surprise, because your mission is why you exist as a company, and the culture should be a direct reflection of that mission. But in order to start, we have to first set a very clear company mission and vision. It has to be concise, compelling, clear, and easy for your employees to remember. If you already have a mission, I think now is the time to ask yourself, is it still applicable to the work we're doing today, or where we want to go as a company? I mean, I saw this happen a lot in my time working with startups, where we start out with a certain vision and mission and we pivot, and that's fine. The important thing is that you want to go back and revisit it, especially after the year we had. I think a lot of companies are rethinking their vision given the pandemic, and I think it's worth revisiting. And kind of to put into context why this is so important, especially when we're talking about goal setting, a mission should be something that's really inspirational. For example, some of you might have already heard this example with NASA, but a man's cleaning the bathroom and somebody goes up to him and says, what do you do here? He's like, my job isn't scrubbing toilets. My job is sending people to the moon. And that's where we want to talk about the day-to-day work, how that's tied to a greater purpose is super, super critical and part of the culture to make sure that people are feeling empowered and inspired day to day when they come to work. Alex, anything you want to weigh in here on vision?
Yeah, I think both of these elements are incredibly important. I would throw in values as well, just so we go a little deeper. And I think the last 12 to 18 months, these three things, I think, have suffered. And they've suffered because I think actually most companies, believe it or not, I think most companies have something, and they might have something really good. What the pandemic completely undermined was the reinforcement of these elements with consistency. It was one of those things that companies were just trying to survive, and the additional meeting to reinforce, people just missed the opportunity. So I think from the context of a goal framework, this are so valuable strategic inputs. And these inputs are what really set up a company to be able to set goals, regardless if you use OKRs. These elements set any company up for success. So while Lindsay and I might be very passionate about OKRs, these are foundational concepts that a lot of companies actually need to revisit. Even if you revisited them a year ago, I can't stress enough, when you get people focused, even on things that are pretty good, the worst thing that can happen is everyone gets excited again about how they care about each of these elements. So I definitely think that this is something for people to revisit. Lindsay, I know you've got some interesting data to share around mission.
Yeah, definitely. So mission is mission critical when driving growth. So some other findings that we found, just to kind of hammer the point of why mission is so important. In our recent survey, we found that folks who felt committed and believed in their mission more often reported that they're inspired by the work they do. So they take more risks, they communicate more frequently with their managers on their progress, and they just overall feel more inspired. Compared to the folks who didn't believe in the mission, as you can find, not a big surprise, but they weren't as inspired, they didn't take as many risks, and they communicated a lot less. And so I think one thing to note here is that these are all strong behaviors of an intellectually safe work culture. And you're going to hear me talk about intellectually safe work culture a lot, because I think that's part of what really, really drives being able to have a safe space where people are going to take risks. So it needs to be, what does that look like? What does that mean? It means that it's okay to make mistakes and own up to them. It means that employees feel that they have a voice to show that their work actually matters. And it's creating that trust and feedback loop so that you can have risk taking, because you know that this is about learnings and it's not about getting a score or a grade, and that's a safe place to have those learnings. Alex, anything else you want to weigh in here that you've seen in terms of mission?
Well, I think that we'll talk more about psychological safety. And of late, I think I've been trying to connect it to get people to think about it. It was difficult to have a growth mindset in the pandemic. We clearly are hopefully at the tail end. And so I think adopting a growth mindset, and in order to do it for other people, especially downward in the company, going back to psychological safety and a violent agreement, that it's something that everyone needs to be thinking about more.
Yeah, definitely agree. So I think the next step is ask yourself, are you getting enough from your goal framework? So now we have a mission, we have a vision, and now we're going to start talking about how do we actually set goals that are aligned with this mission and vision to inspire employees. So once you know where you're going as a company, it's time to introduce your goal management framework. For those of you who don't have one today, for those of you who do have one, it's time to ask yourself, are you getting enough out of it? What's working, what's not, and why? So as Alex mentioned, obviously we're biased to OKRs as a framework, but it doesn't really matter as long as you're just making sure that your goals are consistent and at the heart of all of your operations. Alex, I'd be curious to hear from you. What are some indicators that you've had with clients where you can see that the goal frameworks they have in place are just not working? Like it's time to reconsider. It's just not working for whatever reason.
Well, I think, it's first when you walk through the door and you ask about it, people's reaction tells you a pretty interesting story. And the challenge with a lot of goal frameworks is that they're engineered for efficiency. They're not necessarily engineered for engagement. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the inherent things that OKRs have that balance efficiency, engagement, and flexibility. And so those are the three dynamics that I think some goal frameworks, they're just too efficient, they don't engage, and they're oftentimes inflexible. And so that can really put people off. And part of the battle is just getting people to engage. You can't just give someone a goal, put some rosy words around it and give it to someone. That's essentially a dressed up quota. And I think the challenge is, and this is obviously the remnants of a command and control culture or a practice. And so certainly we're seeing more and more companies try to be more progressive and collaborative. So I think you've got some interesting data, and we'll talk more about this over the next few slides.
Yeah. And I think speaking to that, another thing that we did surface in our survey was the type of goal frameworks that people are using and how well they're working. So when compared to other goal management frameworks, we found that OKR users report that they do achieve their goals more frequently and they feel more inspired to take risks. They feel more committed to the work they're doing. And what's most relevant to today's topic, they actually were the ones who rated their culture higher than those of other goal management frameworks. So again, I think this is part of the nature of how OKRs are run, but no, I don't think it's a huge surprise there that we're finding these findings. Alex, any comments here on other frameworks that you see and feel work best?
Well, I think one of the common challenges a lot of companies have with their framework is setting the appropriate expectation around the quarterly cadence. A lot of frameworks are easy at the annual level. And so, as I was explaining to a very linear person who was pressing me on, Alex, what's the big thing about OKRs? An OKR just sounds like a well articulated goal. Well, so if you just look in isolation, you could make that comparison, but a framework begs an important motion, and not just a motion at the top, but a motion that gets more people involved. And so the challenge that a lot of other goal frameworks, they don't really get into, they're trying to be efficient, so they set it at the top, and they kind of imply, and if you want to break it down to everyone else, that's up to you. I think with OKRs, and we'll talk a little bit more, I think there's an expectation, maybe not immediately at the beginning, but at some point, it's to get everyone involved in the process. And by it being inclusionary and being able to do it every quarter, that frequency plays a huge role in, I think it happens to be a framework that produces well-articulated goals more frequently. So can anyone make a well-articulated goal? Of course, we see it all the time. But when we think about people distribution, so 20% of everyone in a company, they're going to put out well-articulated goals because of their talent. 20% of the company probably doesn't know what a goal is, and in spite of any framework, will never understand it, get it, and might not be the best fit for the company. So a goal framework serves the middle 60% the most. And so I think when companies look at frameworks and they actually do what they're supposed to and try to be as inclusionary as possible, I think intuitively and iteratively, some companies have adopted practices that weren't necessarily part of the goal framework, but they knew that they had to get more people involved. So I think that's what I'm seeing outside of OKRs. And it's certainly, there are practices that companies can consider if they're married to their goal framework. How do you make it better? Well, you need to think about frequency of cadence and more inclusion.
Yeah, and that's something common we've seen too. I think, to your point, that you can write great goals, but the consistency of that, right? Like you might have a framework, but how they're being written and what is a good goal, a well-crafted goal that is measurable. I think that is something that we're seeing commonly pop up here, where people might think they've set a great goal, but then when we actually come back and look at it and edit it, it's, within that framework, is it actually a great goal in the way that it's written? And I think that gets into a lot of what we're talking about too. We're, setting, I think oftentimes, I think we've all been guilty of this. I know I have in my career of working at organizations where we set an annual goal and it's great and it's ambitious. And then we don't really look at it again until about midway in the year. Or let's be honest, we're in December and we look at it and we're like, geez, like what happened? Why didn't we accomplish this awesome goal that we set? This seemed like a great idea in January. And I think that's speaking to breaking it down into the quarters. I think that's something where the magic is of this reflection. And I think that speaks to kind of our next point of, we need to make sure that goals are really part of your organizational rhythm. That is a huge part of being able to achieve these goals and embedding them into your culture, making them part of your rhythm. This is a topic that we talk about with our clients a lot. How do you set a culture around your goal setting and make sure that it's being embedded on a regular basis? So this is part of how are you going to write them? Kind of to my earlier point, are we all writing them in the same type of formatting? When are we writing them? Are we writing them annually? Are we writing them quarterly? How are we executing them? Are we having weekly meetings, bi-weekly meetings? I know, Alex, you're going to talk a little bit more about this specific rhythm, but that's important. Are we doing QBRs? Are we doing mid-year reviews? How are we executing on them? And how are we going to reflect on them? Do we establish protected time to have reflection meetings? Do we talk about start, stop, continue? What went well? What could we do better? how does this impact how we set new goals? And I think at the top of it, how is leadership going to demonstrate this? I think this is all part of how we're going to make this part of our organizational rhythm. Alex, anything else you want to weigh in here on making goals part of your rhythm?
No, I mean, I think on this next slide, you're going to talk about things that I think I think you have to cue people to increase the chance, especially that middle 60%. So they're actually doing the right thing. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about those important cues across the quarter?
Yeah, definitely. So here at Ally, when it comes to embedding goals into your business rhythms, we like to instruct our clients to think about these 3 key moments. And these are, you can see, it's a continuous cycle that's going to go on not only throughout your quarter, but throughout your year, where goals need to be embedded. So 1, you're going to start out with planning. And again, this could be the beginning of the year, beginning of every quarter, but you need some protected time to plan. And this can be setting your corporate, team, individual goals, all of those targets. I think one common mistake that we see here is people don't give themselves enough time to actually have these conversations. And again, because this is cyclical, you need that review period of what went well before in order to plan what you're going to do next. But this is super, super important to give yourself some time and have the right people in the room. These shouldn't be done in a vacuum. These should be done together as a team for the stakeholders who are involved. And then the second B is execution. So now you know what you're going to do. Great, go do it. This is how you're going to get the work done. But more importantly, how frequently you're going to check in on these goals. So we don't just set them and then put them on a shelf and don't revisit them. We need to have a way that we're going to be executing them and talking about it as a team so that as we're executing on them, we can see, oh, did something happen? Is there a risk? Is there a blocker? We need to make sure that we're progressing on track. And if not, what kind of plan do we need to create to get back on track so that we don't hit the midway point and we're way off track and we have no idea why, or we've even forgotten what goals we set at the beginning of the year. And lastly, arguably one of the most important steps at making sure goals are the focal point of your culture is reflection and how you do that reflection. So this is what we're talking about with a lot of the intellectual safety of, hey, we're going to go and look at your OKRs or your goals. How did you do? What went well, what didn't, and most importantly, why? And that why is super important because yes, while we're going to score them, the score actually isn't the important part. It's not about getting a good grade. It's about why did something go really well? What can we double down on? Why didn't it go well? What are the factors? And how are we going to then go back into planning and do something differently to push the business forward? So each of these steps informs the next step and is just a continuous cycle. And part of these rhythms involves the measurement and frequent communication around progress towards goals. So as part of our survey, we saw that there's a direct connection between an employee ranking their culture and the frequency in which they met their manager. So the more they met, the more they reviewed the progress, the higher they rank their culture. Makes sense. You're staying aligned. You all know what's going on and you're communicating really well. Alex, do you want to kind of show us what this might look like in practice?
Yeah, so for me, I think this is where I'll flex a little for OKRs. I think a lot of times leaders don't think about what they can cover in a team review versus a one-on-one. And in OKRs, the thing that we're trying to drive and the intention of the framework is to create a weekly OKR habit. And so if a leader can choreograph the use of that team review or that one-on-one, it's going to reinforce the habit. So first, there's the benefit of the habit. Then it's increasing the value of each of those meetings. So I know you're going to tell us a little bit about some strong opinions you have in terms of running team reviews.
Yeah. I mean, I have some best practices that, these are just things we've kind of collected over the years that we found work well for our clients. So these are tips that I give everyone when they're asking, well, how do I set these? And one tip ahead of this is, OKRs and goal setting, part of making sure that it becomes part of your business rhythm is that you don't want to give people another thing to do, that's going to take up a lot of time. So again, we're focusing on 2 to 3 things that are really, really important and the highest impact. So I encourage people, look at your existing meetings as you showed in the chart before this slide. Do we have existing one-on-ones? Can we take 10 minutes out of that to quickly talk about our OKRs? Think about that existing cadence. And then I think some of these key reminders will help you be more efficient. So for example, before each meeting, ask every team member just to update their goals or their OKRs. So we have a recurring calendar invite for the team. So maybe if you have a team meeting on Monday, on Friday, it prompts everyone like, hey, spend a few minutes, update it. So that way we go in and we're looking at our dashboard and it's up to date. Start with what's at risk or behind first. So the reason we recommend this is, again, if you're having a review meeting, let's say you're doing a Monday commitment meeting, you want to discuss why you think things are off track, and you want to develop an action plan to get back on track for the week. So what resources are you going to need? Blockers removed. How are we going to make an impact on this now versus waiting later? On the flip side of that, make sure that you are talking about what's going well, because this is where you want to double down. So it is important to acknowledge and praise the kudos. And some of that might even be informative of how you get back on track and how you're going to make sure that you're removing blockers. So sometimes we see that common cadence is on Monday commitments. Here's what we're going to do. Here are the blockers. And then Friday, we talk about those wins and we celebrate them and we talk about what worked, what didn't. And something to frequently, maybe you don't do this in every one-on-one or every weekly, but you want to touch base with the team on, are we still focusing on the right things? Like, do we need to change any objectives or move anything to another time period? Did something else come in that we need to reprioritize? I think that's something important that you want to think about just frequently, that are we still focusing on the right things? And then planning ahead, look at what are your goals for the quarter? How many days do you have left in the quarter, and creating realistic plans for that? So do we need to be doing some groundwork this week in order to set ourselves up for success in the upcoming weeks? And so this I would say is an average agenda or template that we like to recommend for our team meetings that helps. And of course, add and subtract whatever you need. But yeah, these are some of the key ingredients to success that we've seen, mostly with team meetings. Alex, I mean, when it comes to one-on-ones, I know they're similar, but there are some nuances. Do you want to kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I'd love to kind of expand and add to what you said, that oftentimes as an organization is trying to shift the culture, I think you have to ask yourself, where are your meetings, whether it's team or one-on-one? And then when you infuse the goal framework and make it more predominant, the key thing is about always trying to, as a manager or leader, trying to lead and maybe get through the review piece quickly and go into problem solving and helping and supporting. I think that's it. Companies and some leaders can easily get lost in being very status update heavy. And I think that's a big, big pothole in any goal framework, including OKRs, that you must use the OKRs in a team review or a one-on-one in order to make it more additive. So let's talk about kind of the common concepts, if you're not familiar with one-on-ones, things that are foundational in terms of how, in a one-on-one, a leader should be really making progress on having a better conversation. And the key to that, it's not because if I work for Lindsay and she asked me, hey, Alex, you're only at 50% on your KR, it's framing it as, hey, Alex, I noticed you're only at 50%. How can I help? Hey, Alex, I noticed you're at 50%. I've got some ideas on how you can get to 100. So that subtle difference of using a number, but use it as a bridge to help, not a stick to enforce some misguided accountability. So that's an important aspect. Oftentimes, feedback doesn't flow well in one-on-ones. And that's why, frankly, at People Stretch, we talk about mastering the one-on-one. If you want to have a great culture, master the one-on-one. Take every single one seriously, regardless of how long someone has worked for you. And these are the three areas where you can always improve in a one-on-one. So OKRs help the better conversation. There's an opportunity, and oftentimes it's easier for managers and leaders to give feedback, So let's just assume they're giving feedback, but are they getting feedback? So we've done surveys before, and we see a disproportionate small amount of managers, leaders soliciting feedback on maybe the feedback that they gave. Did it actually work? Was it helpful? Oftentimes, the conversation is more of a monologue than a conversation. It's talking, it's talking at the employee and then giving feedback and never going back to see if it mattered. So I think that that's incredibly important to really think broader and think more widely and holistically about feedback. It goes both ways, and OKRs should facilitate that first in the conversation, then the feedback. The last area that I think is a common miss is taking advantage in a one-on-one to recognize someone. People oftentimes, when they think of recognition, they think of a big award in front of lots of people. And while some people like that, every introvert in your company ruse the moment when they have to get in front of everybody because they're introverted and they would prefer kind of something a little bit more low-key. So rather than embarrassing them in front of their peers, think about behind closed doors, how you might be able to recognize the amazing effort they did, whether they're a programmer, they work in accounting, pick the role. There's plenty of introverts everywhere. And by giving them that recognition, they really appreciate it. Now, here's the thing. Extroverts like recognition wherever they get it. So giving more of recognition behind closed doors works for more people than actually doing it in front of their peers. And OKRs makes it easy when you're seeing someone, especially past 100% of goal, like, hey, recognize, give them the recognition of what they did to blow their key result away, even before the retrospective. It's a great opportunity in order to make a big difference. So that's it on one-on-ones. Let's talk a little bit about celebrating and reflecting.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is super important, as you mentioned, part of that reflection piece. But yeah, now that we've talked about kind of how to make sure goals are at the center of your day-to-day operations, I think this is arguably the most important step of goal management, reflection. Not only success, but failures and what that actually means. So success, you want to celebrate what worked, right? We want to acknowledge that and make sure that people understand that we're seeing their contributions. And failures, again, this is not I think a lot of this is reframing what failures mean, and even that word that it's learnings. We didn't necessarily fail. We can talk about how, a lot of the work that I used to do with validation was, hey, we're doing all this work now so that we don't build something out and waste more resources. So while we might kill an idea or it failed, we learned so much and we saved time and energy that, we otherwise wouldn't have if we weren't checking in frequently and celebrating and learning from those failures. So I think it's really important to acknowledge what didn't work and what you learned, and that start, stop, continue in your pursuit of excellence here.
That's awesome. So the one thing I want to kind of just share is that oftentimes a lot of people get triggered by celebration, thinking that everyone deserves a medal. So I just want to clarify, having a great culture is not about everyone gets a medal. It's about actually celebrating the people that deserve the attention. And so I just want to throw that out there, because a lot of times when people hear celebrate, they think about that. And I think I just wanted to throw that call out.
Yeah, definitely. I think, as you mentioned, celebrations, and we have some examples that we've used, but I think it's about matching it to what's going to work not only with your company existing culture, but as you mentioned, an introvert and extrovert. How does this person want to be celebrated? The important thing is that they're being acknowledged. And same thing with the failures, that we're talking about failures in a way that works with the culture and that people understand it's about learnings. And that kind of gets into what we've been talking a lot here with establishing an intellectually safe culture. And I know, Alex, you have a lot of thoughts about this too. And in order to celebrate successes and, more importantly, failures, you have to create this type of culture. And this is a common pitfall that we see with a lot of our clients, where people are a little bit scared to set goals that are so transparent, because they feel like if they don't accomplish 100%, they're going to get punished for that, or that's going to look bad on them. So this is one of the best parts of using OKRs, that they are meant to be ambitious. You should feel uncomfortable. You should feel like, oh, this is a lofty stretch goal. I don't know if we're going to accomplish it. And that's okay, because that's going to be what pushes your business forward. So that's, again, the beauty of it, that these targets are going to cause you to really, really think outside of the box and be very, very lofty goals, because that's going to start building that culture of taking those risks. So you might not always achieve 100%. That's okay. What did you learn from that? How far did you get to that lofty goal? And in order to do that, what an intellectually safe culture looks like is that it's okay for people to make mistakes, and people owning the mistakes. So people aren't trying to hide that they didn't accomplish something. They're actually like, hey, I made this mistake. This is what happened. This is what I'm going to do differently. And others are going to learn from that too, not only themselves. And it's great for everyone's benefit of talking about that openly. As we've kind of hammered in, showing how everybody's work matters, everybody's contribution matters to the greater mission. And that helps give employees a voice, that they feel that they're being recognized. They have a voice in this company. They're not just another cog in the wheel. And celebrating differences. A lot of times people feel that they have to be doing something set in one way or another. But if we're celebrating, hey, this person did something different, thought outside of the box, and that was okay because it accomplished X goal, or X learning, then we want to talk about that. And I think another shift in the mentality of this is just being compassionate and encouraging trust, because people aren't going to take risks if they don't feel trust. And that comes from the top of the leadership, your managers, and a lot of what we talked about, those strong behaviors of communication. When your employees are going to feel that they have that trust, that they can take these risks, they're going to take more, and therefore they're going to do more bold things to push these ambitious goals forward. So a lot of that foundational building is super, super important. And I think Alex, you'll go a little more of the last point of just making sure you create the space for feedback, that this is positive and constructive. I know some people kind of dread having their reviews with their managers. And we want to flip that and have it be like you're looking forward to that review with your manager, because you're going to feel some of these great things. They're going to talk about, what went well, and they're also going to give you constructive feedback on what could be better. And hopefully next time you have that conversation, you're continuing that loop of improvement and that growth mindset that is vital for achieving and pushing businesses forward. So Alex, I know you have a little bit more to share with us here on retrospectives. Like, what do these look like? How do we run these?
So keying off your last point, I think an organization, this is an area where they actually cut corners. And so the efficiency, most goal frameworks don't have a quarterly retrospective component. And so I think, why a quarterly retrospective? I think at the very most basic level, it's to celebrate the wins and to learn from potentially some of the losses. And the reason that's important is, as human beings, I think leaders want a culture where they can nourish the sense of accomplishment. By nourishing a sense of accomplishment, you increase people's self-confidence. And so when you increase self-confidence, that contributes to trust. So the combination of trust and confidence starts getting people to lean in and really take risks. That's an important, I wanted to call out, because while you can have trust, if you're not confident, all the trust in the world is not going to get someone to really lean in. And so with OKRs, the first couple of retrospectives, you have to start asking yourself, okay, so how'd we do? And you can think about them. What was kind of, where are we trying to get to? What's best possible? What do we think are wins, victories achieved? What do we think was most probable? I think if you go to the next slide, we oftentimes get a lot of questions about how do you do a successful retrospective? And I think these are our go-to questions that I think will always surface great content. In spite of this, we can give this to them. Where organizations really stub their toe is that they go from not doing it to doing it. but then they don't record and capture and compare. Okay, so how many wins did we have? How many learning lessons did we have? Do we see them going up? Could we plot it on a graph? Everyone is so focused on how they performed, but programmatically, hopefully you're going in an upward basis. And I think when you sit back, and oftentimes leaders need to look at the OKR program and ask these questions. Do we have high percentages, especially by the third OKR cycle? Hopefully we will have very low percentages that said, oh, it wasn't the right objective, or it wasn't the right key result. The reasons for lack of attainment are different. So it takes a couple quarters to get through that. If you go to the next slide, I think we try to get people thinking about what might come out. And so what are key learnings? So here you see some of the key learnings. And the one that I've seen the most consistent is fewer KRs. So, people are ambitious. Like some people feel cooped up because of the pandemic, and now they have an opportunity to really get things going. So in the first quarter, they leaned in, and certainly now in the second quarter, people have been really aggressive. And I think categorically, while people want to accelerate, I think there's still some real constraints, like there's COVID fatigue is real. I think people need to take real vacations this summer. Hopefully everyone on the webinar will be able to do that. I think we have to pay attention to where our energy is and hopefully use the summer to actually get back to a steady state where we can start building on. And so I think these themes we'll see a lot over the next 3 weeks as we facilitate a lot of key results. And so I'll go to my last slide before I think you've got some interesting data to share with us. The celebration insight that, to me, especially for the executive leader, is that what do you want to take away from a retrospective? It's the focus and alignment. Did your team, because of your goal framework, get more focused and get more aligned? That question has to be answered by the executive leader. So now, once again, you can answer that outside of OKRs, but I think that's an important question that in OKRs, the question gets asked every quarter. And I think it's a healthy check for a CEO, a president, at whether or not the team is executing. And you can learn a lot by how that person answers that question. But Lindsay, tell us a little bit about some creativity in celebrating wins and learning.
Yeah. So throughout working with our clients, we've kind of had some fun ways where we've seen them start to celebrate better. So I've kind of compiled a list of those. And again, some of these might feel a little Silicon Valley or may not always be applicable, but that's kind of the fun of it. The point is find something that is central to your culture, but some things that we've seen on how companies start to do some of these retrospectives and then actually celebrate what they're learning and coming out of those before they go into the next planning period is like a church of fail, where each month people, they kind of make play of it. Like they stand up and talk about the mistakes that they made. It's wildly applauded. Prize for the best failed idea. Those really help encourage innovation. Doing kind of the weekly, this could be beer and champagne, this could be donuts. I think it's a little bit different now that we're all virtual, but having some kind of celebration on, what happened this week. And something consistently that a lot of people have is like a wall of love, where this is where we're talking about individuals, right, that are just getting recognized for their work. And this is one that I particularly really like because, like, for example, I've seen this with Slack channels where they have a wall of love Slack channel and they'll tag somebody in there like, hey, I was just on a call and Alex just did a fantastic job with this client doing X, Y, and Z. And it's a really small gesture, but it has a huge impact because it's showing the recognition for this individual. And two, it is very visible company-wide. Like everyone can see that. But it's not a big medal or anything like that. It's just a like, hey, you were doing your job. I recognize that. And appreciate it and want everyone to know how great that was and how that contributed and made an impact. So just a few tips. Be curious if any of you have any ideas that you've seen at your companies. Feel free to throw them in the chat that you want to share. I always just love hearing the different creative ways that people are just celebrating learnings and failures. So with that being said, just to kind of wrap things up of what Alex and I know we went through a lot of content here, but just ways that you can make goals more front and center for your organization. So number one, remember to start with your mission statement. Does it truly capture what your organization stands for? And if things have shifted, update it. Two, if you're not already using a goal management framework, start using one, and make sure that you're getting alignment, buy-in, and focus and transparency from it. Consider OKRs as a framework if you're looking for that. And three, make sure you're using goals, not just as a way to measure what you're doing, but truly, truly move your business forward. So again, that's setting very ambitious goals. The reason you're only setting 2 or 3 is because when you go and look back at the end of the year and think, these are the 3 things I'm going to be very happy we did and are going to really, really, truly move our business forward, I'm going to focus on just those 3 things. So you'll hear a lot of me and Alex saying, radical focus or permission to do less. Like that's what we're talking about here. Like you're not trying to do everything under the sun. You're just focusing on those 2 to 3 mostly impactful things. And then weaving those through the company and making sure that your planning and execution and reflection is all there. And Alex, maybe you can take us home here on points 4 and 5.
I'm just going to pick up where you left off. And as you've woven through the company in the planning part of the quarter, you have to measure the results regularly to build the habit, to make sure that the thread goes throughout the quarter. And certainly we spoke about celebrating success and failures. There's an opportunity to do that in the retrospective. And I think Lindsay even gave an example of how to do that outside of team reviews and one-on-ones. And to me, a lot of people need to be clear that it's about being additive. And so if you're trying to build culture, these things are all additive, but they do require a certain amount of work. So it's kind of like I use the going to the gym. If you go to the gym and only use one machine, you're probably not going to make that much progress. Using any goal framework requires a minimum level of commitment. And depending on how ambitious your organization and you are, you can use all of these takeaways. Don't just pick one. You need to think about them in totality if you want to get more out of any goal framework. So Lauren, I think it's time for Q&A.
Yes, awesome. Thank you, Alex and Lindsay, for walking us through that. Already seen some positive feedback from our audience. Sounds like they already had some great takeaways, which is exactly why we're here. So with that, it's your turn, audience. If you have questions for us, comments, or things that you'd like us to revisit, now's the time to please enter those into. We've seen both comments in chat and the Q&A widget, so either works. I'm going to start with a couple questions that came in during the presentation. And this one I'm going to point over to you, Alex, to answer. It says, many of our teams are using goal setting, but it's inconsistent across the company. Sounds like each of them maybe have their own method for keeping track of goals. What's your advice for actually getting those teams on the same page? Like, how do you start? What do you do?
Well, I think that's a change management initiative in and of itself, and it's creating awareness that if every team sees the organization as an entity that's bigger than themselves, then they'll understand they have to engage in a standard way of doing a goal framework. It doesn't have to be OKRs, but everyone needs to do it the same way, because if everyone does it the same way, collectively, they will learn and they will get better. That's the nice thing about OKRs, is that it imposes ceremonies, meetings, and it forces people in a not dissimilar way to Agile to really adopt practices that are very systematic in terms of always trying to get better. So that's how I would tackle that one.
Great. I had another question, and I might point this one to you, Lindsay, but obviously, Alex, feel free to chime in as well. This attendee wanted to know, do you believe in celebrating individuals or team or both? Like how do you celebrate and who do you celebrate? Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think my answer would be both. And part of what we talked about, and I think it's about where you're doing that. For example, in those one-on-ones or the wall of love, like you want the individual to know when they wake up every day and what they are specifically doing is impacting a greater mission. But to break that down, their work is impacting the team and the team is impacting the company and so forth. But I think it's important for individuals to feel that they're being recognized, that they are part of a company. So I would definitely focus on celebrating individuals, but also teams. For example, something that we do here at Ally, we have the wall of love, and we have a lot of individual, in our one-on-ones and these feedbacks where we're constantly kind of having those loops. But then every now and then we'll do a team celebration. We'll have the team as a goal where we have our collective team goals, and we'll talk about that and make sure that we're collectively celebrating everybody. So I think it's important to just think about with your culture and your individuals, when is that appropriate, but definitely both.
Great. And I'm going to combine a couple questions that I think are under the same bucket here around 101s. And Alex, I'm going to point this one to you. One, how long should 101s be? And how do you ensure that 101s are consistent throughout the organization, right? Is there a template that you suggest managers follow, a cadence? Maybe you can just speak to more of the specifics of how and how frequently those should be conducted.
So I think every organization has to figure out everyone has to agree on the right length. And I see value of actually having an alternating length. So moving from 30, 45, or 60 minutes, it really, I don't want to be overly prescriptive, but I think human beings like a little variability, just so it doesn't become so rote or potentially stale. So I think that's the first practice. If an organization wants to get better across the entire enterprise, regardless of the size, I say a good practice I find is, a one-pager. So establishing a one-pager on the practice of one-on-ones. So having, and it doesn't need to, the key thing is one page by maybe taking the great points that Lindsay said, so every organization can have a go-to template. Now, certainly for some technology organizations, if you want to get certain certifications, they are adopting and employing templates to have more efficient meetings. So I think that there are a lot of small practices that can be captured in that one pager. And so if you make something lightweight, it tends to go far. I think when people try to over-engineer how to do better one-on-ones, don't get me wrong, everyone should master them, but I think you can capture more than enough of what to master on one page.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. And something I've seen in large organizations, I remember working for one where we started uncovering people were having one-on-ones, like these were on the calendars, but how they were conducting them was completely different. And part of that was just, like you said, a one pager and a quick refresher and training, but also showing the benefits of that. Why are these one-on-ones being different? For example, people didn't talk about what was at risk or what needed improvement. They were only talking about the good things in one-on-ones. And while that seems rosy and like a very feel-good one-on-one, it wasn't moving the business forward. And so we created a structure kind of similar to what I showed you, but just showing people a one pager of this is how we should be conducting one-on-ones. And we're building a culture around, hey, we're all having these conversations that might be uncomfortable at first, but we're going to ease into this. And by the way, the ones that are doing it this way are seeing greater impact. And this is why.
Great. And I'm going to keep going because we still have a few minutes before the hour. But if anyone needs to drop and we weren't able to get to your question, please know that we will happily follow up offline. to get you the information that you need. So another question, and this is around going back to OKRs. I'm going to, again, combine two questions. One is around setting OKRs and communicating them. So what do you think is the best approach? And I know for both of us at Ally and People Stretch, there's the practice of duality versus classic model. But what do you suggest as far as who should be setting the OKRs and how you should be communicating? Should it be the leaders setting it? Should it be bottoms up? Lindsay, you're nodding your head. Maybe you want to kick it off, and Alex, you can weigh in as well.
Yeah, sure. I think one, it depends on every company is individual. I think that is one of the beauties of OKRs is that they're flexible. So thinking about what's going to work for you, there's not one right or wrong way, honestly, to do it. It's what works for you as a company. I think common best practices that I've seen are strategically giving direction early on at a company level. That just helps everybody understand whether you're doing duality or you're doing classic, something to map to. So, hey, 2 weeks before the beginning of the year, 2 weeks before the quarter, this is what the company level OKRs are. And that just gives a strong North Star for everybody to kind of map back and align to whether they're doing duality or whether they're creating their own bottoms up.
So I'd love to give a shameless plug to Ally, since I don't work for the company, but I think an OKR tool's role is to actually facilitate communication. And so I think as a leader, they need to use the tool to make it transparent to everyone. And so if you use a tool like Ally, which does a great job of making it very transparent and very easy to use, then you can communicate it early and often. Some common points that companies really try to push out on is we've seen the adoption of monthly all hands as opposed to quarterly all hands. So I think that that's really important that companies have started adopting. I know this speaks to Katie's question in the chat. I think also it's important to report up what's discussed in the retrospective. We're going through all of this, and by mid-July, most of our clients will share with the entire company what the leadership team found. So I think that there are some great best practices. And to me, if you're communicating to the company every month, and it used to be like every quarter, I think if you're not communicating every month and using OKR, the content from OKRs, it's a huge miss. It's a huge miss. So once again, we know we're a little biased, but I think using technology to help with the communication efforts and certainly thinking about that frequency of communicating out to the company, hey, you can go look how people are doing, but we're going to push out every month. Here are the highlights of where things are going well and where we're really focusing effort because they're not going well. So,
yeah, I think the point of that, having them posted somewhere that's easy and transparent for everyone to see, because you can bring them up in a quarterly town hall and people might be taking notes and remember them, but a place to go back and map to is really important as part of that communication.
Great. Well, we are out of time, folks, and I still see there's some unanswered questions that we weren't able to get to. Like I said, we will definitely follow up and make sure you have the information you need. I just wanted to quickly thank everyone. Thank our speakers, Lindsay and Alex, for all the great information that you shared. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule and being so communicative over chat. We hope this was a useful session to you. Like I mentioned at the start of the webinar, we'll be following up with the recording, as well as some additional resources, including the 2021 goal management report that we touched on. So hopefully kickstart some OKR goal setting discussions at your respective organization. So with that, we're gonna wrap for today. Thank you everyone for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye now.